Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and today I will talk about an unknown treaty, a very important international treaty, but one that's pretty much known only to historians and maybe people who are well read in history, and that is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Okay, I'll just pull this up for you. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, Brest-Litovsk is a rather unengaging city on the border between Poland and Russia, the old borders anyway. I mean, that's not a very nice place to be. It's been taken over by Russians and Germans and Austrians and whatever. But that was the site of the signing of a treaty between Germany and Russia in February of 1918. Now, the background to this was Russia had come into the war on the side of the Allies and had done miserably. I mean, the Russians were just slaughtered. I mean, the whole incompetence of the Romanov dynasty was revealed under Tsar Nicholas II. Most of the Romanovs, they're either called Alexander or Nikolai. Their way of putting down dissension, and every now and then there would be a peasant uprising, was to, kill them or send them off to Siberia. But this guy, Nicholas II, really believed the same autocracy. I'm the boss, I'll tell you what to do. But he's just a very weak character, apparently a very nice person, very personable character. As a matter of fact, the Russian Orthodox Church has, I believe, now actually sainted. I know they're first considered blessed, but now they've been sainted because of their piety and they're he's a decent family man, whatever. But totally incompetent. I mean, he's really, really incompetent. I mean, you can't go say, I'm the big boss, you have to listen to me, but I'm not going to do. Well, he killed people. Of course, you had the 1905 massacre, a group of workers and peasants that were peacefully protesting outside the Winter Palace, and they were mowed down by Cossacks. So it's like he fell into the worst of both worlds, but he was a nice guy personally. Well, at any rate, because of the total incompetence of the government and the loss of, they were fighting, of course, Germany, and Germany just rolling over them. The Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, even the Turks were defeating the Russian army. And finally, the leaders of the army people actually got out and said, you must abdicate, sire. And he did, without any, there was some fighting, some opposition, maybe a couple thousand people, but by Russian standards, that's pretty good. He abdicates, and a constitutional government takes over, and they want to stay in the war. See, they're allied with the Allies, the Western Allies, Britain, France, and now America. But the war is going very badly for them. And the new government says, we're going to keep our treaty obligations. We're going to fight alongside the Allies, of course. But even the new government, there wasn't any improvement. The soldiers were deserting en masse. This is one of the only few times in history where there are more POWs. I hate that word, prisoner of war. Prisoner of who? It should be what we would now call them, enemy prisoners of war, EPWs. There were more EPWs than there were casualties, dead and wounded. So the battlefront got worse and worse. And then you have the communist revolution, the October or November, it depends on which calendar you use, whether it's October or November revolution, practically bloodless. This is interesting. The communists, they didn't have to kill anybody. They just took over. And the constitutional government was so weak, and the whole Russian apparatus was so weak that almost nothing happened. They didn't send the Cossacks in to chop them up or anything. So the communists took over. And Lenin said, and Lenin, of course, the communist leader, peace, land, and bread. Okay, peace. That's the first thing. We got to end this war. It's literally just draining us, killing us. And one of the first things he did was get in touch with the Germans. Now, he had already contacts with the Germans. You may have read about this famous sealed train. The Germans, Lenin was in exile then in Switzerland. And he approached the Germans. He said, look, send me into Russia and I'll literally raise hell there. And that'll be good for you because that'll knock Russia out of the war. And you can say he's a Russian. He wouldn't want to. No, he didn't care about nationalism. Everything was the revolution. And he felt probably the revolution will really come in a bigger way, or maybe sooner, in Germany. That's where you have all these oppressed workers, where Russia is mostly still peasants. But anyway, and so the Germans did that. And as one German general said, we released Lenin into Russia as one release a poisonous pestilence. Of course, those are days of poison gas too, so I'm they're thinking of that also. So they provided train for him, and about 60 of his followers, exiled Russians who had been in exile in Switzerland or Germany itself, and so on. And this was a so-called sealed train. Nobody could get on or off until they got to the Russian border. And then he arrived in what was then called Petrograd. They wanted to more Russify the name. I think this, at the beginning of the war, of course, St. Petersburg, that's not a very Russian name. So they changed it to Petrograd, a very, very Russian sounding name. And then, so I said, he took over by force. I mean, Lenin said that, you don't have elections. Elections is a bourgeois fantasy. We're here for revolution, okay? And the first thing we're going to do now, we've taken over, and we're going to now sue for peace. So he, in a sense, fulfilled his side of the bargain. The Germans let him go out and in the sealed train, and he turned around and said, okay, we'll have peace now. And so they met at the town of Brest-Litovsk, a very charmless town, apparently, battered by the war. But you don't have tourists going to Brest-Litovsk. Well, so they negotiated with the Germans there. And the Germans, of course, they were on a roll, and a roll both east and west, really. And so they laid down very harsh peace conditions. And another reason why the Germans were very keen to get this treaty signed was that would free most of the German troops. They could have maybe occupation troops in the east, but they could then send them to the west. So, and that could really make things very difficult for the British, the Americans, the French. So, but they could just basically dictate their terms to the Russians. Well, the terms were very harsh. I won't go to all the territorial givings up, but it was most of Ukraine, most of the Baltic region, and many of the Russians were many of the Russian delegates, communists. They were all communists, of course, in the delegation. There's no nonsense with other parties or anything. That they still were Russians in many cases. You can't just chop up Russia like this. We can't do that. And Lenin said, we're going to do it, because otherwise the country will fall apart if the war goes on. And he was afraid the Germans were going to eventually take Petrograd itself. So they broke off. Very strong negotiation, not negotiations, but arguments and so on between all the party leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sverdlovsk, Dzerzhinsky, what to do. For many of them, they really tore at them. You're going to tear Russia apart. We can't do this. And so they broke off the negotiations. Well, they didn't permanently break. They said, okay, we're going to have to just stop talking here for a while. And then Lenin finally convinced them that we've got to do a very narrow, it's like a 5-4 vote with the Sovnarkom, which was the government, the administration which they'd imposed upon Russia. And they said, okay, we're going to negotiate again. And then the even worse negotiations. I mean, they took all the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, which had been a Grand Duchy, a part of Russia. And also, remember, Turkey and Austria-Hungary were allied with Germany. So they had their slice of the action too, even though the Austrians hadn't done that well, even against the Russian army. I mean, the Austrians must have been about the worst soldier at the time, probably because there were so many different ethnic groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, there were Austrians and Hungarians and Turks and Jews and Czechs and Slovaks and what have you. It was kind of hard to get an army together that way, but they would get their slice of the action too, with certain territories that where they had abutted onto Germany or onto Russia, they got that, and then the Turks got their Ars and Batum, various areas as well. So it was a disaster for Russia. But Lenin said, you have to drink the poison. It's kind of like a bad tasting medicine. And he talked them into doing that. And incidentally, another thing that the Germans had a nasty way of, when they defeated an enemy, making them pay for the privilege of losing. And in the Franco-Prussian War, for example, France had to pay a heavy indemnity to Germany. It's interesting, actually. The French were so determined to pay off the Germans, they even threw pennies or sous at the German forces occupying Paris, and they paid off the indemnity, and then France boomed. Despite the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. I mean, the Germans territorial things, and then also indemnity. Well, that's what they did with the Russians also, and in both cases, France and Russia, it was gold. And I've actually seen a photograph of these blocks of gold with ropes, which I guess when the gold was molten, they put these ropes in it, and then you could pick it up. I saw these picture of these blocks of gold, I think about 1.5 feet square, being put on the boxcars. I mean, just gold, not no IOUs or money or anything, paper money, gold, and then being shipped to Germany. So, as I said, the way I put it, there is not just you have to pay for the privilege of being defeated by Germany. I don't know. Well, of course, after World War I, we did the same thing to Germany, a just recompense. At any rate, the thing settled down. Germany then was able to transfer its troops to the from the east to the west, and then mount this great offensive, Operation Michael, which really came close to Paris again. But the difference was that Germany is really getting worn out now. There actually was had to be. It's interesting here also. Germany now had the Ukraine. That was the breadbasket of Europe, and they had a wonderful railroad system, which was basically designed to move from east to west in case of war. And yet still, they were getting pretty close to starvation. I think by the end of the war, there were cases. People don't usually just die of starvation, but whatever starvation, you lose your body resistance and fall prey to other diseases. But they were that badly off. So you could say even their ill-gotten gains to the east did not, in the end, stop them. Of course, the great Operation Michael got within almost a cannon, Big Bertha cannon shot of Paris. But the increasing number of Americans coming in, we had like 1.5 million troops in France by the end of the war. Sometimes the Europeans, well, you came in the war at the last minute. Well, we must have been pretty fast at it. 1.5 million troops, actually maybe close to 2 million troops. You have to count those who were in transit and so on. By the time of the armistice. So, and the Germans were beginning, their own troops were beginning to see this. And there were several battles in which the Allies stopped the Germans and then started to push back. And the Germans, actually, the soldiers themselves began to realize this was not the last gasp to win. We're losing this war now. And so we get increasing numbers of surrenders and desertions. And they're getting letters from home saying we're starving. It's interesting. The Germans planned to starve out Britain. And of course, that's how we got into the war. Basically, the sinking all these ships, American ships and Allied ships, sending food from the U.S. and Canada and Australia to Great Britain. And yet that worked, that convoy system. So the magic bullet. Convoys always work. A lot of naval types think, well, convoys, they're kind of defensive. We ought to get out there and swat those submarines. Well, no, there's a big ocean, okay? And you try to find a submarine, but the convoy attracts the submarines. And then you have escorts, of course, destroyers particularly, which can then swat the submarines. And so it got to the point where we're serving a German submarine at the end of World War I or World War II was kind of a death sentence. So anyway, it worked. In fact, I read that for a while, the food supply was so good in Germany that pineapples, which don't grow, of course, in England, were selling more cheaply than potatoes. And I actually saw a photograph of a costermonger, as they call them, like a barrow in London, with pineapples. I forget what the price was, but there was a pile of them there, and they were fairly inexpensive. Meanwhile, the Germans were literally getting to the verge of starvation. In fact, they called the winter of 1917-18 and 1918-19 the turnip winter, because about all they had to eat was turnips. Okay, and there's no more oil from the east and those remaining oil fields. They had been well, I'm not sure what exactly happened to them, but and of course Germany has no oil. They say like to take the subway, the Unterbahn in Berlin, you wreck your ears because there's no lubricant oil, and they screeched, metal on metal without lubrication. Things were very bad in Germany. People were practically starving. The whole country was running down. The people themselves were just worn out, and so they finally sued for peace. And that was, of course, back, as you know, the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. And the point I want to make here is a lot of this, for a while after the war, many like American and British historians, especially Americans, say, oh, this was too rough on Germany, and making the Germans pay an indemnity. Why this is unprecedented. And so I think I'm the only historian, if I may say so, with all due modesty, that has pointed out the Germans going on about the diktat of Versailles. Well, what about Brest-Litovsk? What did you guys do when you had the whip hand? And I say the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was far worse. Versailles didn't chop up Germany. They had to give back Alsace-Lorraine, which you could say was stolen territory in the first place, and some of the parts of Denmark that they'd stolen, the Schleswig-Holstein, which everybody argues about who really was the original owner of Schleswig-Holstein. Of course, who's the original owner of any country, okay? You go back to the indigenous inhabitants and say, well, they had more indigenous inhabitants, go back even further than that. So it gets kind of difficult. Let's give this back to the people who were living there. Well, who were the original people? At any rate, so that's the point I wanted to make about Brest-Litovsk. That, in case you forgot the name again, because it's one of the more obscure thing, is that how brazen, as it were, of the Germans to say that what this terrible. The Germans of that generation, they had this poor Germany, we're just a small country. I read a German writer, not a historian, saying Germany is a small country that lost the war. And well, look what they did though. I say particularly the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. We did not chop up Germany the way the Germans did with Russia. We did make them sign and pay an indemnity for poetic justice, although apparently, and this is quite international financial ledger domain, they didn't pay it with German money. They borrowed the money from Wall Street, America, the international Wall Street conspiracy. And I don't think they ever paid it back because then the Depression came and that was that. And then we got concerned about, well, do we have to fight the new Germany, the new Reich, the Third Reich? But it's just the colossal gall of that. I'm not saying Germans now today. I mean, there's a different Germany altogether. But of that generation going on about poor Germany and the Treaty of the Diktat of Versailles, when you see what they did at Brest-Litovsk. So I say it's a rather obscure treaty, but it had profound consequences because well, you kind of wonder in the long run, because Germany did lose in the long run twice. The Germans go off on these adventures and they have these great ideas. And speaking of great ideas, the Germans had another brilliant idea, clever people. What we'll do is Mexico. Now, Mexico doesn't like the States. Actually, in 1917, 18, it's almost within living memory, the Mexican War, in which we filched this was our unjust war. We wanted Mexican territory and we took it. And of course, the Mexicans never forgot that. And so the Germans said, aha, here's our opportunity. So they sent by telegraph to the German embassy in Mexico. Of course, Germany was not involved in the war, and said, make peace together, make war together, make peace together. Aha. And the British are excellent code breakers, and they had tapped into the telegraph, the underwater cable lines from Germany to Mexico City, and it had interpreted that code. Of course, all the messages then were in code, of course, and now as well. And they gave it to the American. Like, oh, look at them. Could you believe? I mean, the perfidy of the Germans, because the German telegraph said, you will get back the lost territories. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico will be yours if you fight on our side. And we win, which we're going to win anyway by this time, this part of the war. And that basically was what shoved us into the war. I mean, it wasn't just, it was the sinking of our ships and so on. But, and by the way, it wasn't the Lusitania. Lusitania went down in 1915. The war that we did not get in the war until April 1917. So there's a bit of a gap there. It helped. I mean, it helped to solidify anti-German sentiment. But still, but the sinkings of American ships and then the Zimmermann telegrams, another one of these brilliant German ideas, make war together, make peace together. But even the Mexicans even said, we'd like to see this happen, but no, don't get involved. Of course, I wonder what Mexican government there was then, because it was a period of real chaos that it was so bad in Mexico, various Pancho Villa and so on, fighting each other, that we had to send an expeditionary force into Mexico once they'd invaded and burned down an American town, Columbus, New Mexico, and try to catch him. But we never did, and then we had to get back, to go to the war. But anyway, so some of these brilliant German ideas didn't work out so well for people that were supposed to be very, very clever, the best universities in the world, and what have you. But anyway, I just want to just talk about this: the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the forgotten treaty. At which time, I also want to say, why the Germans were Hitler was crazy to invade Russia because look what happened to Napoleon. Yeah, but nobody talks of what happened to. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, they beat Russia. They defeated Russia. And exacted territorial concessions and money too in terms of the indemnity. So it's, but I say for all that, it's sort of one of the forgotten treaties of the world history. Well, that's the end of another episode of Stan the History Man. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned. I'll be back. Bye-bye.